Good morning and welcome to The Edge. My name is Madi Morgan and I'm here today with Mrs. Kocan, a teacher at Peters Township High School, to discuss the topic of how social media affects the lives of teenagers. Social media consumes a large part of the lives of this generation of teenagers. As a high school student, I'm aware of the downsides of our excessive use of social media because sometimes it affects my schoolwork, relationships with other people, and even my sleep schedule. Some might even consider social media an addiction. However, when people learn to set limits on their usage of their phone, these negative effects become less of a problem. An example of a limit that could be set to reduce the effect of cell phones on mental health is deciding on the amount of time teenagers spend on their phone and when is a good time to use cell phones or social media. Studies show that people can easily become addicted and won't have much self-control when it comes to checking their phone excessively. Many teenagers and even adults stay up late using their cell phones as entertainment before bed. However, bright screens inhibit the brain's production of melatonin, the chemical that regulates sleep, which makes it hard to get rest even when the cell phone is turned off for the night. Experts recommend turning off cell phones 40 minutes before going to bed to reduce this effect. Also, students can become so addicted to their social media that they will use it for hours and hours upon night, which messes up their sleep schedule. Students' usage of social media also becomes a problem when they don't separate work from the appropriate time to be on their phones. Social media is now considered one of the most significant sources of procrastination, not only among teenagers, but people of every age. Dr. Piers Steele explained in an article that students are biologically and socially predisposed to put off tomorrow what we should do today. He also states that teenagers tend to be impulsive, leading them to get distracted from work easily without thinking of the later consequences. One small distraction can end up wasting much more of your time because once you break your focus, it takes 15 minutes to get your brain back to concentrating on work. This affects mental health because people end up taking many more hours than needed to complete schoolwork and chores, which causes more stress. Finally, students' dependency on social media for communication affects their face-to-face interactions with other people. The majority of teens don't turn off their phones or ignore notifications from social media when they are with their family or friends. Although it is meant to enhance the way people communicate, social media actually makes people become antisocial. Talking over the internet takes away the factor of emotion and nervousness that important in-person conversations have, so people prefer to talk about more serious topics through social media. The lack of connection people have in person is becoming unhealthy. So, thank you so much for joining me today.
Sure.
The first question I want to ask you is, as a high school teacher, how have you seen these effects reflected in your students?
I think the need for kids to know what's going on their phones is more pervasive, but I don't necessarily in my specific classroom have too many issues. Every once in a while there's an issue as far as in the classroom.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know what's happening at home. I can only surmise. But overall, I think that if, I just say no, put them away.
Yeah.
And that's the simplest way to go about it. I think that being able to control that impulse is pretty important because every time the phone buzzes or you get a notification or a text, you can't be looking at it because it'll be distracting all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
So in class, obviously, that's not the time to be looking
Never.
at stuff like that.
No.
All right. How can adults get through to students about the importance of turning off your cell phone?
So I have a 13-year-old, and he got a phone when he was 12. I made a pact with some of my friends, so we kind of held off on purchasing phones, although he had iPads and whatnot. I think that it just has to be a routine practice. So for instance, at 10 o'clock in my house, I have the Wi-Fi set to automatically shut down. Now he is younger than you, so sometimes you have a game and then you get home and you have to do homework, and some of you rely on that phone for research or to find information. Yeah. But overall, I think it would probably be easier if we said, no, you have to use the computer rather than the phone, because you're not going to have texts over the computer. You're not going to necessarily have every social media platform up on your computer. So you could be slightly more focused, I think. That's what we do in my house, and I think that you would see your productivity increase. Little things such as setting limits. We do an 18-minute thing in my house too, where for 18 minutes, what can you get done without any distraction? and it normally works pretty well.
So why do you think that, like, it's more parents' responsibility or the kids' responsibility to control this?
I think you need to work together. I think that if a child or a teenager looks at it as a hold on them, like a punitive kind of thing, that it won't work well. But I think that, for instance, I did this with my son. Let's see for 18 minutes what you can get done with no distractions whatsoever. And he finished all of his homework that the teacher said, probably will take about an hour. Yeah. So I think that those kinds of things, just little steps at first. You can't say, well, I'm taking your phone for 2 weeks because you didn't, you're on it too much. Well, that's not going to help anyone because it just makes you want it a little bit more, I think.
Yeah. So then how do you think that, like, students should motivate themselves to get off their phones without their parents' help?
Oh, geez. Okay, so that's a difficult one because I think there are so many social media platforms, but I think that just it has to be done through commitment. And I know it's kind of ridiculous to say because your brain doesn't fully develop until you're 25, so you don't understand necessarily the impact that it could have. But overall, I think that if you're looking at the situation and you're saying, I'm not getting anything done. I'll give you for instance, okay? When I look at email here, I could look at it every period. We get emails quite often, but I take one period to just look at the email, finish it, and get it done. It would be quite a bit about time management in conjunction with the want or desire to be on it. But it also depends on what you're doing at the time. Are you focused on homework? Do you have work to do at home? Do you have, what are you doing? So that's the bigger question, I think.
Well, I think a lot of students, like, realize these effects and how they're affecting their own life, like procrastinating their work and stuff. But why do you think that some people, it's like they just don't try to change it?
Because habits are really hard to break. So, for instance, if you have someone who bites his or her fingernails, you can only say it so many times, you need to stop biting your fingernails. But I also think the other thing is limiting what you're doing. For instance, do you need to be on Instagram and Snapchat? Maybe just one. If you are an addict, a self-proclaimed addict, maybe the way to go is to say, well, I have an issue because I'm constantly on it and I'm not forming relationships and I'm not communicating with other people. Maybe I should deactivate one of my accounts.
So, like, out of the effects that I've talked about in, like, my intro and stuff, which one do you think affects students the most and why?
I think for a while ago, I read an article about what was considered the Facebook effect. I know you don't use it because you're young, but the Facebook effect, I think, applies to a lot of people. It's we're looking and we're seeing everything through, like, rosy colored glasses and thinking everyone's life is better than ours, which also ultimately I think affects mental health a little bit. And so, I mean, as far as I'm concerned with those kinds of things, you just have to make a decision. It's going to have to be a hard decision, but you have to make that.
Yeah. So if a lot of people see social media as a negative thing, but there's a lot more benefits to it, why do, like, the negative things kind of overpower everything else? Like, more people talk about the negative things than the positives.
Because I think it's so pervasive. I think that, for instance, I use social media to connect with people that I don't get to see very often. You see 1,600 kids a day, right? So you're constantly in contact with them, but the social media aspect of it is there's some kind of euphoria that's involved. So if you get a text from someone, that's exciting. Just like it was when I used to get pieces of mail. When was the last time you got a piece of mail, like, in the mail?
I mean, from, like, my grandparents.
Right, but that's still exciting, right? So if you're getting some kind of instant feedback, or you're getting like a meme from someone, that raises your euphoria a little bit. You're excited because someone's communicating with you, and it's not as scary as approaching, but approaching people is really very important. So I think that has quite a bit to do with it. Did I answer that question?
Kind of.
Okay.
But so if it's really important to like connect to people face to face, how do you think that people can start changing their habits of like not being able to connect to people?
So I think that, are you talking like as far as school is concerned, or just in general?
School and in general, like
connecting with people face to face. It has to be a specific effort, I think, by lots of people, but that's not necessarily going to happen because you have the phone in hand.
Yeah.
So you have to make an effort. I mean, ultimately the onus comes on the person because they're not going to take the platforms away. And your parents can't always monitor it either.
Okay. Yeah, so a second ago you said how like you use social media as an adult to connect to people you don't see as much. So then why is social media not as addictive to adults than it is to students?
Oh, I don't necessarily agree with that.
You think it is?
I think on some levels it can be.
So how do you see it in people like your age, like your colleagues and stuff?
I think that people use social media, for instance, I use it to find out what's going on in the world. So for instance, right now, and really all the time, we have political issues, right? And so people focus on what's happening in the world, specifically what's happening with politics. And you see that people are connecting on social media platforms, but it's not always appropriate. Yeah. Sometimes there's open conversation and it's quality conversation, but sometimes the problem is it becomes name calling and there's some nastiness that's perpetuated. So I don't necessarily believe that kids have worse addictions than adults. I think it's an individual basis.
Kind of equal for both.
I think that it's possible. It just depends on the personality and the draw to the social media platform. Yeah. So for instance, there are many teachers who have Instagram accounts where they impart like lesson advice, or they'll post things that people can use. That is done for good. You know, it just depends on which platform, what it's about. I don't know how many people use Snapchat. I don't.
Yeah, well,
so
it's just kind of different between generations, but
correct.
Do you think it does like affect just people of all ages?
I think so, because I remember several years ago someone wrote an article that said to the mother at the playground, get off your phone. You know, the kids are running around and they're having fun and you're texting. And there could be a retort to that. Someone could say, well, I work from home and this is what I do, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess, you have to look at it on an individual basis. But it is pervasive, and I think it can be problematic.
I agree. All right, so we're going to take a break, and after we're back, we will just continue this little discussion we're having.
Sounds good.
All right. So welcome back. We are going to continue our conversation about social media. So what I want to get into now is the lack of like connection between different generations, like how maybe people my age like aren't as formal to like adults and stuff these days.
Okay, so interesting story. Again, I have a 13-year-old. I have other kids too, but he's a teenager, they say. So nevertheless, we recently had a reception for him for making his confirmation. And I had to say to him, Andrew, you have to get up and go over and greet the people who are coming. And he looked at me, he goes, will you stand there with me? I said, no, I'm not going to stand there with you. I think that you should be able to do these things, walk up and shake someone's hand or address them or have a conversation. One of the areas where I see that level of disconnect is when kids ask for recommendation letters for college. I have to say to them in the junior year, please just don't send an email or an aviance request. You have to go and ask the teacher. Well, that's scary. Well, it shouldn't be that scary if you're asking them for a recommendation, right? If you feel comfortable enough asking someone for a recommendation, you should feel comfortable enough asking them face to face.
Exactly, and if you've been in their class all year, obviously you know them pretty well, that it shouldn't be that kind of disconnect there, but...
Right. We also have, I think, an issue because I'm older, clearly, and we were taught to do all those things. We also had to answer the landline, the phone, and talk to someone, not get a text.
Yeah.
So communication was a little bit different, was more interpersonal, not necessarily so electronic.
Yeah, well, I mean, I relate to what you said about your son. Like, even at family events, like, with maybe relatives I don't know as well, like, I find it, like, nerve-wracking to go talk to them, and they're related to me. So, like, that's probably not good.
No, but why?
I don't really know why. I guess I don't know them that well, and I'm only, like, comfortable talking to the people, like, that I talk to on my social media that are, like, my friends and stuff. So, like, I don't know. I guess it's just...
So what if you were in a situation where, I mean, someone's going to be your boss at some point who will be older than you and you don't know, so you would have to address them. Or maybe you're interviewing for college. Exactly. Sometimes you have to interview for scholarships and whatnot, so you would have to have a conversation with people.
Yeah. Well, once I actually do get into the conversation, I, like, don't feel as nervous about it, but I guess it's just, like, the idea of being formal, because I feel like social media it's, like, such a informal environment that teenagers are on 24/7, and then when you have to go and email someone, phone call someone that's, like, older than you, and, you know, a more formal setting, it's kind of nerve-wracking to talk to them.
So on the flip side of that, if you feel more confident doing those things, you interview better. If you feel more confident doing those things, you come across as someone with more character. So those are character building things that social media or texting can't teach you. And I know we've moved from, like, the letter to the email, but the email is still really important. For instance, when you interview for a position and you say, you know, you email a thank you response or you handwrite a card, you still have to address them. And so I'm not quite sure why. I don't understand why kids are scared.
So obviously this, like, lack of connection is unhealthy, but do you think it's a mental health effect, or is it just something we need to work on that's, like, not that big of a deal?
I mean, I think that it could be. I think part of the problem is that, let's give a for instance, when you are posting something, whether it be a tweet, whether it be a photo on Instagram, whatever you use, even a YouTube video, you have the ability to edit those things.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you do not have the ability to edit in real-time situations, but the real-time situations are often the most authentic and the most real and the most visceral, from where you'll get a response and you build upon those things. The other thing is, if you fail, and I hate to use the word fail, but if you do not succeed, you just have to learn from those situations. We can't edit life.
Yeah. Well, how do you think that affects mental health then? Like, if the pressure to be more perfect, like editing things, and then you can't do that in person. Do you think that, like...
Yes, I think it could be scary. But I think also that we don't look at things in a process. So for instance, you know, if you were applying for some kind of internship or whatever, again, if you cannot necessarily feel comfortable in your own skin, it comes across to the person who's trying to connect with you. And that doesn't necessarily work so well. So I think that anxiety probably increases, and I think that our abilities to cope with those levels of anxiety are difficult. I also think that, for instance, I don't know, I'll give you an Instagram example. It's easy to take a filter and make a picture pretty, right? And maybe you look like you're having a great time wherever. But at the end of the day, someone else is looking at that saying, wow, I wish I was living her life. But
it's not real.
But they may not necessarily know that you also have struggles. And so we project to the world that things are always great, fantastic, phenomenal, because we can edit it. And that's not necessarily a healthy environment.
Not at all. Yeah, how do you see that in students? Like, I mean, maybe not in the classroom as much, but like being around kids all day, how do you see them? Like,
well, I think that this need for perfection stems from a bunch of different areas. And one of the areas that it stems from is social media. So I used to run a blog, and family blog. And so I was in an event, and I remember and I'm an adult, so I remember very specifically someone who I've known since I was a child. She came up to me, she goes, "Are you trying to make us all look bad?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Well, you're always posting about all the fun things that your family's doing." And I said, "No, I'm not trying to make you look bad. I'm just enjoying my life." And I thought this platform was a good place for other people to go to different places. If you haven't been to the Mattress Factory with your kids, you might want to go. If you haven't taken your kid on a Just Ducky tour, you might want to go. I said, this isn't about you, and here's the other thing. So people are looking at this saying, I'm deficient in some area because I'm not doing this with my children, or I'm deficient in this area because I'm not doing this makeup tutorial, or I'm not contouring or whatever.
Yeah, so you think it affects like students' self-esteem? How does it affect adults too?
Oh, like I just told you. I mean, she was like angry with me. And I think that it's easy to look at all of these platforms and say, oh, she's living her best life, or he's living his best life, they're having a blast, they're having fun. But we also don't know what people are going through on a personal level. You know, maybe people are posting photos because they have self-esteem issues, or maybe they're just having fun. It's individualistic, and I think that that's been lost.
So the issue with like self-esteem that teenagers might already have, how do you think that social media increases it?
Having a lack of self-esteem?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I mean.
So I think it can be beneficial, but social media, I'll say this again, it can be beneficial, and I don't have much information about this, but I know that I would think that negative keyboard courage, I'll call it, it's easy to have keyboard courage and to badmouth someone or to post a disparaging photo of them without any real-time consequences. So if you would be angry at someone and you would post something and you didn't really think about what you're posting before you did, I mean, that's a form of harassment or bullying, which I know happens. I don't know how much it happens because I'm not a kid, but you know, that obviously would have issues. And then if a bunch of people jump on the bandwagon, well, that's the mob mentality of bullying. Yeah. So that could definitely have a negative effect. Kids could be school phobic. Kids could not want to go outside. Kids, would shun other people, and that would be a problem.
Well, I think as a high school student that I know most people my age know that these are bad effects and that it's not the healthiest for us, but why do you think that students don't really make an effort to change it and they'll still say stuff like that on the internet?
Because stepping outside of the norm is hard when you're a teenager. Stepping outside of the norm also brings attention to you. So if you step outside of that norm and you say, and we're trying, there's an effort, focusing on kindness and focusing on compassion. Those are things that are they should be innate in you. Someone should be fostering those things. But once you step outside of what everyone else is doing, then you are also open to ridicule, which is scary. It's scary for kids.
Well, if you're posting on social media, obviously you're getting attention for that, negatively. So why getting maybe positive attention for being the one who's nice and doesn't, why do students want to avoid that if it's...
I don't think they necessarily want to avoid it. I think sometimes it comes down to the courage to do it. So there are probably kids, and you know this to be true, there are kids who may be bystanders. They don't see what's happening, and they are not necessarily strong enough to speak out against the masses, but they also don't do anything to help the situation. And those are the people that you want to provide some support to. If you think something's negative, you have a voice to say that something's negative.
A voice on social media or a voice person to person?
I think both. I think both. The problem is there's a mob mentality for social media. And so if you say something, people jump right on it because it's easy to type it. It's much more difficult to say it face to face to someone.
Yeah. So when it comes to speaking out against that, how do you think that students can make it a more positive effect than a negative effect when talking to other students on social media?
I think the way in which you word things, instead of a stream of consciousness, I'm going to just say everything I feel. Take some time to think about what's important. And if I were on the other end of this tweet, post, whatever, how would I feel?
Yeah, I think that's important too. That is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining me. To sum up what we've discussed today, the downsides of social media can have negative effects on students and their mental health. However, there are many ways to set limits and control these problems. Thank you for watching. I'm Madi Morgan, and this has been all for today's episode of The Edge.